Hello, it's Marty Braden again. Our topic today is life's a pain and then we die. I was hoping that'd catch your attention. Before I share my thoughts on this topic, I'd like to take a moment and explain to you the why behind my videos. And that's because I think it'll help you better understand why I'm doing the videos that I'm doing. I'm getting close to finishing my review of the arguments from my last chapter of my book, An Atheist Delusion. It's chapter 10. And so I'm almost done with this project, but there's a lot more to talk about, and so I won't be stopping my video reviews anytime soon. If you aren't familiar with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you may be familiar with the pejorative slang ism we are sometimes referred to as Mormonism or the Mormons. As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I prefer to be called a Latter-day Saint. But anyway, all of my topics for my videos come from An Atheist Delusion, which I recently published. It's my Latter-day Saint perspective on atheist Richard Dawkins' anti-theist, anti-Christ book, The God Delusion. As you probably know, Richard is world-renowned. He says that he simply has a lack of faith in God's existence, but he does have faith in naturalism or materialism, which is a belief in the quasi-doctrine of evolution, along with its chief tenet, natural selection, a theory born out of the mind of Charles Darwin's atheism, who lost his faith in God as it led up to him finishing his book, The Origin of Species. Right at the beginning of Richard's book, in his introduction, Richard wrote, quote, "The purpose for writing The God Delusion was to make atheists out of everyone who reads his book." So, once I published my book, I decided to set up my YouTube channel, and I called it An Atheist Delusion. But it's under the name Martin Braden-Author. My channel allows me to record and post short videos of me reviewing every single one of Richard's anti-theist, anti-Christ arguments that he put forth in his book. And so far, I've posted 120 videos covering those arguments. The newest video you're watching right here is part 121. And so with that said, let's pick up right where I left off last time. It's the first of 3 remaining subtitles in chapter 10, and it's called Consolations. Let's go right to that. Richard, as he himself said, thinks that it is infantilism that lies behind the need for a God. The true adult view, he contrasts, is that our life is as meaningful and as full and as wonderful as we choose to make it, and we can make it very wonderful indeed, end quote. What Richard is really saying here is that anyone can feel this need for finding meaning for their life without having to believe in some kind of or any kind of childish fantasy or make-believe friend, which Richard calls the sky god. In other words, just decide to make it so and it is so. Richard continues, "It is time to face up to the important role that God plays in consoling us, and the humanitarian challenge, if he does not exist, to put something in its place," end quote. Here is the consolation issue reasoning Richard hopes his readers will buy into. He says, if you take religion away, people truculently ask, meaning aggressively or self-assertively ask, what are you going to put in its place? What have you to offer the dying patients, the weeping bereaved, the lonely Eleanor Rigbys, for whom God is their only friend? End quote. Richard immediately responds to his own question saying, quote, "Religion's power to console doesn't make it true. Even if it were conclusively demonstrated that belief in God's existence is completely essential to human psychological and emotional well-being. Even if all atheists were despairing neurotics driven to suicide by relentless cosmic angst, none of this would contribute to the tiniest jot or tittle of evidence that religious belief is true." End quote. I appreciate Richard's relentless doggedness to take down any argument for God's existence, no matter how insignificant it may be. That seems to be what new atheists do. This argument from consolation, in my mind, is one such insignificant argument. But I do want to interject one personal thought here. It is something that Daniel Peterson referenced in his talk we just covered in the last video. It's an analogy given by William James, who was, some have argued, one of the greatest philosophers ever produced in the United States. He was the brother of the novelist Henry James. His Principles of Psychology was a foundational text in the discipline of psychology, but he, more importantly, has become famous as a founder of pragmatism. William's analogy was about a carriage ride. William is talking about decision-making under conditions of uncertainty where you don't know with absolute certainty whether X is true or Y is true, but you must decide nonetheless. This sounds very much like the big questions to me, don't you think? William begins by saying, and I quote, "Imagine yourself in a carriage. The driver has gone in to get a drink. Suddenly the carriage begins to roll down the hill and is going faster and faster and faster. You must decide. You're sitting in it. You must decide. How are you going to react to this? You're not sure whether it would be safer to stay in the carriage. You know that it might be safe, but on the other hand, it might smash into something at the base of the hill and you die. Would it be wiser to jump out now? Jump out. On the other hand, if you jump out, you might be killed. You just don't know. Williams says, quote, under conditions like that, either decision is rational, end quote. That's a statement of rationality that says if you can't really decide, you have to just go with one, and it's, as long as it's roughly 50-50 or 60-40 or something like that, not an irrational decision. You might turn out to be wrong, but you were reasonable in making that decision, end quote. An end of analogy. I mentioned this analogy and Dr. Peterson's comments about it because I think this is what Richard is getting at when he says, quote, there's a difference between between belief in God and belief in belief. Between belief in God and belief in belief itself. The belief that it is desirable to believe, which is one choice, even if the belief is false, which is the other choice. It may be evidence in favor of the desirability of convincing yourself that God exists, which is one choice, even if he doesn't, which is the other choice, end quote. Richard says, doesn't this appear to be a 50-50 choice? And then uses a Bible verse to make his point. He quoted in the book of Mark 9:24, which says, Lord, I believe, one choice. Help thou mine unbelief, the other choice. Next, Richard makes a sarcastic comment, quote, the faithful are encouraged to profess belief whether they are convinced of it or not, end quote. Richard certainly did not get this verse's meaning at all. To me, Richard's understanding of it sounds like what Williams' carriage ride analogy was describing. It's a basic statement on rationality. It says that if you can't really decide, you have to just kind of go with one of the choices, and it's, as long as it's roughly 50-50 or 60-40 or something like that, you're not making an irrational decision either way. You might turn out to be wrong, which Richard says belief in God is, but at least you were reasonable in making that decision because it gives you some kind of consolation from making it. Richard believes that when people feel consolation from believing in God, it's really just them believing in belief. And so it's not because God exists and is providing the consolation. This sounds a lot like that feeling a young woman gets when she's being in love with love, and not so much from actually being in love. It's enjoying the idea of love and not actually experiencing a real love relationship with someone. Richard gives an example of this to prove his point. He says, I think we all know people who enjoy the idea of religious faith and resent attacks on it while reluctantly admitting that they don't have it themselves. Richard then gives an example of this by introducing a hero of his, Peter Medawar, who said in his book, The Limits of Science, the following, quote, I regret my disbelief in God and religious answers generally, for I believed it would give satisfaction and comfort to many in need of it if it were possible to discover good scientific and philosophical reasons to believe in God, end quote. Richard's atheistic mind sees belief in God in any way, shape, or form as being an irrational belief, and argues one can live a happy and fulfilled life without supernatural religion, end quote. To me, what Richard is saying is that all of this talk about man's need for consolation being one of many proofs that God is real is just hogwash. It is irrational, just like belief in supernatural God is irrational. So where do we derive consolation from then, Richard? What are its sources? Is one's belief in God simply the result of our mind trying to come up with a way to fill this human need to find consolation when life, with all its sufferings, happens? I ask, if we're just another animal in the animal kingdom, then why the need for consolation? Why would natural selection keep this mental and or emotional need for consolation in us and not in other animals? Richard continues, quote, false beliefs can be every bit as consoling as true ones, right up until the moment of disillusionment. This applies to both non-believers and believers, end quote. Again, here's an example to describe what Richard is saying here. A man with terminal cancer may be consoled, he says, by a doctor who lies to him that he is cured, just as effectively as another man who is told truthfully that he is cured. Sincere and wholehearted belief in life after death is even more immune to disillusionment than belief is from a lying doctor. The doctor's lie remains effective only until the symptoms become unmistakable. Yet a believer in life after death can never become disillusioned, end quote. Richard then says, quote, this being true, wouldn't you expect that religious people would be the least likely to cling unbecomingly to earth life? Why deem mercy killing, abortion, and euthanasia to be a sin if you sincerely believe you are simply accelerating a journey to heaven, end quote. Well, here's my answer to Richard's sarcastic queries in order to make his point that all of this consolation business is wasted energy in his mind. For me, mercy killing, abortion, and euthanasia is killing someone, and the act of killing is a serious sin. A person's life is shortened unnecessarily when you kill them. Our life here on earth is a time to prepare to meet God before this life's test is over. Ending our probationary time, there's the key point here, prematurely shortens our ability to repent in order to be prepared to meet God. Through his questions, Richard reveals his atheist mindset and how little he understands the sanctity and purpose of life. Richard further shows it when he asks, isn't there an important difference between having your appendix removed under anesthesia and having your life removed by drugs that kill you quietly and quickly, end quote. Richard answers his own question saying, not if you are going to die anyway, and not if you have a sincere religious belief in life after death, so that life is just a transition from one life to another, end quote. In other words, what's the big deal of the euthanasia, he says. You're just getting to the next ride faster, and it's a happier ride than this one. End quote. If Richard truly believes what he is suggesting here, and I'm confident that he does not, then using his logic, the entire population of the world should be terminated because life's a pain and then we die. If what Richard says is true, then why not just kill everyone, which would make it possible for us to leave this life of pain and disappointment and simply go on to the next state of happiness that's found in heaven, right? Of course, that's ridiculous, and Richard knows this argument he's giving here is ridiculous. Richard is simply mocking believers who believe in the afterlife. Richard continues, quote, it is those of us who death as terminal, sees death or views death as terminal rather than transitional, who might naively be expected to resist euthanasia or assisted suicide. Yet, we, the atheists of the world, are the ones who support it, end quote. He continues, when I am dying, I should like my life to be taken out under general anesthetic. Richard and all atheists, I suppose, say this because an atheist reason that this act would simply stop the unnecessary pain by inducing death, and death, in Richard's way of thinking, is becoming just like he was before he showed up here on earth. He was nothing at all, just as death will make him become nothing at all once again. Do you truly believe that you are nothing at all before your life here on earth? I ask you, my viewers, do you truly do that? Let me insert a quick note from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints website, where it states its leaders' position on the sanctity of life and their opposition to euthanasia, and I quote, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believes in the sanctity of life and is therefore opposed to euthanasia. Euthanasia is defined as deliberately putting to death a person who is suffering from an incurable condition or disease. Such a deliberate act ends life immediately through, for example, frequently termed assisted suicide. Ending a life in such a manner is a violation of the commandments of God, the commandment being the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill or do anything like unto it. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does not believe that allowing a person to die from natural causes by removing a patient from artificial means of life support, as in the case of a long-term illness, falls within the definition of euthanasia. When dying from such an illness or an accident becomes inevitable, it should be seen as a blessing and a purposeful part of eternal existence. Members should not feel obligated to extend mortal life by means that are unreasonable. These judgments are best made by family members after receiving wise and competent medical advice and seeking divine guidance through fasting and prayer, end quote. Richard quips, quote, religious people who fear death Doesn't speak strongly of religion's power to comfort the dying. Is it fear of punishment? No, Richard, it is fear of the unknown. It is fear of purgatory. It is fear of another kind. There certainly are more than one reason why people fear death. Richard asked, quote, why don't all Christians and Muslims say something like this when they hear that a friend is dying? Do give my love to Uncle Robert when you see him. Especially those who are soon to die. If they know there is life after death, why do they fear it so, he says. I would ask Richard, just how, in your way of thinking, Richard, should the theological mind work in terms of how they should speak and act when the loved one is soon to pass on? Should they set aside their feelings of losing their loved one's companionship or their close association with a friend, which friendship will no longer be available to them, or the loss of ever enjoying any and all future special events with them, such as marriages, the birth of their loved one's baby, etc., etc.? Talk to you soon? Really? Are you kidding me, Richard? Talk to you soon? Come on, man. Richard then goes on into a long rant on the doctrine of purgatory, an example he gives of how Catholic parishioners pay monies to minimize the time they think they'll have to spend in purgatory, or to even avoid it. Of this bounty, Richard quips, quote, I'm sure the proportion of medieval treasures of art and architecture started out as down payments on eternity. This, of course, is Richard's unique way of slamming Catholics and their unique Catholic belief in what they call purgatory. Richard sees this belief as a form of consolation and as deserving scorn. I choose not to scorn it. There are some theists who think that mankind's constant search for a source of consolation to help fill the holes in their lives is proof of God's existence. Otherwise, life would be empty, pointless, futile, a desert of meaninglessness and insignificance, and full of all kinds of pain for which there is no consolation. That argument, Richard says, is infantile, and putting it forward as one's need for God to be filled is going back to Binker-ville. Once again, that quip actually made me laugh out loud the first time I read that. Binker-ville. Anyhow, the next subtitle is inspiration, but I'm going to stop here. This whole idea, truly, one could be very sarcastic and say, life's a pain and then we die. That's what it is. It's pain. It's 2 years, 1 year, 25 years, 80 years, 100 years, and then you die. Life's a pain and then we die. That is a very shallow, unaware idea of what life is and what life's about. But truly, if the atheists are true in their feeling that life ends at death and they just become a dirt pile, then justice will never be served. All the injustices that happen that haven't been resolved by courts or other means. The pains and sufferings will have no meaning. It just was a tough life, and then you become a dirt pile. The whole idea that you come here, you just started out as a bursting of cells that all of a sudden grew into a body, and your brain was electrical and popped out a thought, and then started getting good at popping out thoughts, and directed you, and there was beauty somehow. Where it came up with numbers and language and beauty and talents and creativity, that's just a wet brain doing random thinking on its own, I suppose. And then after 80 years, you die and you end up being a dirt pile again. Nothing before, nothing after. Why does it even matter to want to do something good? I mean, what is it about? And I think that's why every human being on this planet asks those questions. Why am I here? Where did I come from? Where am I going when I die? Is there life after death? Is there a God? Those are one of those questions. Why does natural selection cause those thoughts to stay in the mind? And it came from the very beginning of man all the way to all the billions on the earth today are still asking those questions. Why did natural selection cause that to stay in man's creativity and their mind and their thinking and their consciousness and their self-awareness to ask those kind of questions? Does it really save them from death, which is ultimately just a dirt pile? Think about that. It does not make sense. It does not make sense. There's another set of reasons why, and we'll get into that. But that's the discussion on consolation. So if you have some thoughts, I'd look forward to hearing what you had to say about this. And any questions you have, I'll do my best to get to it as quickly as possible and answer those questions that you have. So until next one, which is going to be very, very interesting, I think you'll love it. But until then, I want to wish you continued success. Goodbye.